The title of Duke of Rothesay and the other Scottish titles which I've had the honour to carry for so long, I now pass Catherine.
The decision was revealed without applause, public ceremony, or advance notice. Deep within the private rooms of Buckingham Palace, a confidential order confirmed that Catherine had been entrusted with a position carrying unprecedented authority for a modern royal woman. A single declaration shifted the monarchy's future. One official approval placed Catherine accepted the crimson folder without speaking. The royal seal pressed into the wax was unmistakable, yet the weight in her hands felt heavier than paper alone. She studied the cover for several seconds before breaking the seal. Across the room, William watched quietly, sensing from the expressions of the palace officials that this was not another ceremonial appointment or routine briefing. The first page carried only a short instruction. Read in full before discussing with anyone outside this room. The words immediately changed the atmosphere. Catherine continued reading while the silence deepened around her. The document described a newly established constitutional responsibility created under the king's authority, one intended to protect the continuity of the crown during periods of uncertainty. Unlike honorary patronages or symbolic royal duties, this responsibility involved direct oversight of emergency planning, institutional stability, and the preservation of constitutional order should unexpected circumstances threaten the normal functioning of the monarchy. When she reached the final paragraph, she stopped. She read it again. Then she slowly lowered the document. William searched her face for an answer, but she offered none. The calm expression she usually carried during public engagements had given way to careful disbelief. One senior palace advisor finally broke the silence. The king believes this responsibility cannot wait. Those words settled heavily inside the room. For months, speculation had surrounded the future of the monarchy. Questions about long-term stability had become increasingly difficult to ignore, and senior officials understood that uncertainty itself could become a constitutional risk. Confidence in the institution depended not only on tradition but also on clear preparation. According to officials present during earlier discussions, the proposal had undergone repeated legal review before reaching the king's desk. Every clause had been examined to ensure that it strengthened existing constitutional arrangements rather than replacing them. This was not about changing the line of succession. It was about protecting it. Catherine closed the folder carefully before placing both hands upon it. She understood that accepting additional responsibility would inevitably alter the balance of expectations inside the royal household. Every future decision she made would be examined not simply as the work of the Princess of Wales, but as someone entrusted with safeguarding continuity during exceptional circumstances. William stepped beside her. Quietly, he asked whether she had expected anything like this. She answered with a gentle shake of her head. No. Nothing more needed to be said. Outside the chamber, the corridors of the palace continued with their usual rhythm. Staff members crossed polished floors carrying briefing papers. Equerries prepared schedules for upcoming engagements. Visitors admired portraits that had witnessed generations of royal history. Yet inside that private room, something significant had already begun. The king had not created a public spectacle. He had created a safeguard. Elsewhere within the palace, whispers had already started. Several senior officials knew confidential meetings had taken place over recent weeks, but almost no one knew their outcome. Even those closest to the sovereign had been given only fragments of information. The unusual level of secrecy suggested that whatever decision had been reached carried implications extending far beyond ordinary administrative changes. One advisor remarked privately that constitutional resilience often depended on preparation long before a crisis appeared. Another disagreed. He believed such preparation inevitably reshaped relationships within the institution itself. Both understood the sensitivity of the moment. Late that afternoon, Catherine requested time alone. She walked through one of the quieter palace gardens where the sounds of London seemed distant behind ancient stone walls. Responsibility had always accompanied royal life. But responsibility backed by formal constitutional expectation felt entirely different. She thought about the years spent building public confidence through consistency rather than spectacle. Every engagement, every appearance, every difficult period faced alongside William had quietly contributed to the trust now being placed in her. Trust, however, came with consequences. Once accepted, it could not easily be set aside. Inside his private study, the king reviewed another copy of the same document. He remained seated long after his advisors had departed. History showed that monarchs rarely remembered the easiest decisions of their reign. They were remembered for the difficult ones. He understood that today's signature would invite interpretation from every corner of the country. Some would see prudence. Others would see preparation. Still others might imagine tensions where none officially existed. Such reactions were unavoidable. What mattered most, in his view, was ensuring that the institution remained steady regardless of changing circumstances. As evening settled over the palace, William joined Catherine once more. Neither spoke immediately. Finally, he asked a simple question. "Do you trust why this was done?" She looked toward the lights beginning to appear across the palace grounds before answering. "I trust the responsibility." Her reply revealed both conviction and caution. Beyond those walls, the public remained unaware that an important constitutional chapter had quietly begun. By the time the announcement eventually reached the nation, attention would naturally focus on titles, headlines, and ceremony. Few would ever learn about the private conversations, or the difficult choices that came first. The official announcement had not yet been released, but within the walls of the palace the effects of the king's decision were already becoming visible. Meetings appeared on private schedules without explanation. Confidential files moved between offices under tighter security than usual. Senior aides who normally worked independently now consulted one another before making even routine recommendations. No public statement had been issued. Yet those closest to the institution understood that something important had changed. Catherine noticed the difference almost immediately. Conversations that had once ended with polite observations now paused whenever she entered the room. Palace officials greeted her with the same courtesy as before, but there was a new sense of caution beneath their words. It was not fear. It was awareness that the responsibilities she had accepted would influence decisions reaching far beyond ceremonial engagements. William observed the shift as well. During an evening meeting in his private office, he quietly remarked that the atmosphere throughout the household felt different. Staff members appeared careful not because anyone had instructed them to behave differently, but because uncertainty naturally encouraged restraint. "The palace always adjusts before the public notices," he said. Catherine understood exactly what he meant. Institutions built over centuries often changed gradually. The most significant moments rarely announced themselves with dramatic speeches or public ceremonies. Instead, they revealed themselves through subtle adjustments that accumulated over time until everyone realized the old routine no longer existed. The following morning, the king convened a confidential gathering with several senior constitutional advisors. The discussion centered on one question. How could new responsibilities strengthen stability without creating confusion about existing authority? Each advisor offered a different perspective. One argued that clarity would prevent speculation. Another believed that revealing too much too quickly could encourage unnecessary political debate. A third reminded the room that the monarchy depended upon public confidence as much as legal precision. The king listened carefully before responding. "Our purpose is continuity," he said calmly. "Not uncertainty." Those words guided every decision that followed. Meanwhile, Catherine received another sealed briefing prepared specifically for her new responsibilities. Unlike previous documents, this one contained detailed emergency procedures covering communication between the royal household, government officials, and constitutional advisors during periods requiring coordinated leadership. She read each section slowly. Every page reinforced the same principle. Preparation existed not because crisis was expected, but because responsible institutions prepared long before uncertainty arrived. Later that afternoon, Catherine and William met privately inside a sitting room overlooking the palace gardens. The atmosphere was noticeably quieter than usual. William placed a handwritten notebook upon the table. "I've been thinking about what happens next," he admitted. Catherine looked toward him. He continued. "People will assume this changes relationships inside the family." She considered the observation before answering. "It doesn't have to. But they'll believe it does." Neither attempted to dismiss the possibility. Experience had taught them that public interpretation often developed independently of reality. A single headline could shape weeks of speculation, while private truth remained known only to those directly involved. Across another wing of the palace, several household officials reviewed organizational procedures that had remained unchanged for years. No offices were being abolished. No titles were disappearing. Yet reporting structures connected with emergency planning required modest revisions to reflect the king's newly approved framework. The adjustments appeared administrative. Their significance was far greater. One experienced official quietly remarked that constitutional resilience depended less upon dramatic reform than careful preparation invisible to most observers. His colleague nodded in agreement. "History usually notices only the outcome," she replied. "Not the planning." As evening approached, the king requested a private conversation with Catherine. The meeting took place in one of the oldest rooms within the palace, surrounded by portraits of monarchs who had each faced moments requiring difficult judgment. The king spoke without ceremony. "Responsibility often arrives before confidence," he said. Catherine listened carefully. "I know many people believe strength means certainty," he continued. "I've learned it often means accepting uncertainty while remaining steady anyway." His words carried the weight of experience rather than instruction. She thanked him quietly. Before leaving, she asked one question. "Do you expect resistance?" The king paused. "Questions," he answered. "Questions are inevitable." That distinction remained with her long after the meeting ended. Outside the palace, journalists continued reporting on routine royal engagements, unaware that preparations for a significant constitutional announcement were entering their final stages. Inside, every department completed its assigned responsibilities with remarkable precision. Draft statements underwent careful legal review. Communication teams finalized schedules. Senior advisors verified procedural details one final time. Everything pointed toward a single conclusion. When the announcement finally reached the public, attention would naturally focus on the title itself. Few would realize that the true significance rested not in ceremonial language, but in months of quiet preparation designed to ensure that the monarchy remained steady regardless of whatever challenges the future might bring. By dawn, the palace would be ready. Whether the country was equally prepared remained an entirely different question. Morning arrived with a sense of anticipation that could be felt well beyond the palace gates. Newspapers speculated about an important royal development, television presenters spoke cautiously of an impending constitutional announcement, and commentators debated what the king's latest decision might mean for the future of the monarchy. Despite the growing attention, no official details had yet been released. Inside Buckingham Palace, preparations continued with deliberate precision. Communications teams reviewed the final wording of the announcement for what seemed like the 10th time. Constitutional advisors checked every reference to ensure that centuries of established practice were accurately reflected. Every sentence mattered because even the smallest misunderstanding could encourage weeks of unnecessary speculation. Catherine remained focused on her scheduled engagements. She had insisted that public duties continue as planned, believing that consistency was itself a message of confidence. Visitors who met her that morning noticed nothing unusual. She greeted guests warmly, listened attentively, and carried out each engagement with the calm professionalism that had become one of her defining qualities. Only those closest to her recognized the quiet determination behind her composure. William joined her after the final engagement of the day. "The announcement is ready," he said. She nodded without replying immediately. For several moments they looked across the palace gardens, where staff members continued their work as though it were an ordinary afternoon. The familiar routine reminded Catherine that institutions endured because thousands of unseen responsibilities were carried out faithfully every day. "The public will have questions," she finally said. William smiled slightly. "They always do." Elsewhere in the palace, the king held one final consultation with his advisors before authorizing the release of the statement. The discussion no longer centered on legal language or administrative arrangements. Instead, it focused on public understanding. One advisor suggested emphasizing continuity above all else. Another recommended explaining that the decision strengthened existing constitutional processes rather than replacing them. The king agreed with both observations. "The country deserves clarity," he said. "Confidence begins with understanding." Shortly afterward, the official announcement was released. Within minutes, news organizations across Britain interrupted their regular programming. Headlines appeared on television screens, mobile phones, and newspaper websites almost simultaneously. Reporters gathered outside Buckingham Palace while correspondents offered immediate analysis of the constitutional significance of the king's decision. Public reaction was swift. Many welcomed the announcement as evidence that the monarchy was planning responsibly for the future. Others questioned what practical responsibilities the new arrangements would involve. Constitutional scholars appeared on broadcast panels to explain that preparation for extraordinary circumstances had long been part of responsible governance. Social media filled with discussion. Some praised Catherine's reputation for steady public service. Others emphasized the importance of preserving confidence during periods of uncertainty. Although opinions differed, one point quickly became clear. The announcement had captured national attention. Inside Kensington Palace, Catherine watched only a brief portion of the coverage before switching off the television. She understood that public discussion would continue for days, perhaps weeks. Yet she believed that lasting confidence would be earned not through headlines but through consistent service over time. Later that evening, she met privately with William. Neither spoke about newspaper commentary or political analysis. Instead, they discussed the responsibilities that lay ahead. "The attention will fade," William observed. "The responsibility won't," Catherine replied. He knew she was right. Royal history had repeatedly shown that public interest often focused on moments, while genuine leadership was measured across years. As darkness settled over London, the palace gradually returned to its familiar rhythm. The day's excitement gave way to quiet corridors, late meetings, and careful planning for the engagements still to come. The announcement had been made. The immediate questions had been answered. Yet those within the royal household understood that an announcement was never the conclusion of an important decision. It was only the beginning of the work required to justify the confidence placed in it. For Catherine, the coming months would not be defined by the title itself but by the example she set while carrying its responsibilities. Every appearance, every decision, and every conversation would contribute to the public's understanding of what the king's trust truly represented. The headlines would eventually change. The expectations would remain. And within the palace, everyone understood that history rarely judged important decisions by the day they were announced. It judged them by what followed afterward. The days following the announcement unfolded with remarkable calm. Outside the palace gates, crowds gathered each morning hoping for a glimpse of the royal family, while newspapers continued to examine every detail of the king's decision. Commentators debated its constitutional significance, historians compared it with earlier moments in royal history, and broadcasters invited legal experts to explain what the new responsibilities might mean in practice. Inside the palace, however, the atmosphere was noticeably different. The excitement that had dominated the first 24 hours gave way to quiet routine. Officials returned to their daily responsibilities, confidential briefings resumed their normal schedule, and preparations for future engagements continued without interruption. For Catherine, that return to routine mattered. She believed that stability was demonstrated not by dramatic gestures but by consistency. Every meeting, every charitable visit, and every conversation with members of the public reinforced the principle that service remained the foundation of royal life. One afternoon, she joined the king for a private discussion following a constitutional briefing. The papers before them covered emergency planning, public engagement, and long-term institutional priorities. Much of the conversation focused on practical matters rather than ceremony. When the meeting concluded, the king remained seated for a moment before speaking. "There will always be people who measure leadership by titles," he said quietly. Catherine listened. "I've learned that history measures it differently." She asked how. "By judgment." The single word stayed with her. Over the following weeks, palace officials observed how naturally the revised constitutional arrangement settled into place. Communication between departments became clearer, planning procedures were refined, and responsibilities that had once depended upon informal understanding were now supported by written guidance. None of these developments attracted newspaper headlines. Yet they represented the very purpose behind the king's decision. Preparation was succeeding precisely because it appeared uneventful. William recognized the same pattern. During one evening conversation, he remarked that the greatest achievement of any constitutional safeguard was ensuring it rarely needed public attention. "If people stop talking about it," he said with a smile, "perhaps that's a sign it's working." Catherine smiled in return. "I hope so." Meanwhile, public interest gradually shifted toward the royal family's ongoing work. Coverage increasingly focused on community visits, charitable initiatives, and official engagements rather than constitutional speculation. The announcement that had once dominated headlines slowly became part of the broader story of a monarchy adapting carefully to modern expectations while preserving long-standing traditions. Even so, the significance of the king's decision remained understood within palace walls. Senior advisors occasionally referred to it during planning meetings as an example of thoughtful preparation. Younger staff members saw it as evidence that continuity depended upon careful organization as much as public ceremony. The lesson was simple. Strong institutions prepared for uncertainty long before uncertainty arrived. Several months later, Catherine attended a national event alongside William and the king. Thousands lined the streets, waving flags and applauding as the royal procession passed. Watching the crowds, Catherine reflected on everything that had changed since the day she first opened the sealed document. The responsibility had never been about personal recognition. It had always been about preserving public confidence in an institution larger than any individual. As the ceremony concluded, the king briefly turned toward her. No words were exchanged. None were necessary. The quiet acknowledgement between them reflected mutual understanding rather than celebration. Trust had been given. Responsibility had been accepted. Now both would be measured over time. That evening, the palace released photographs from the day's engagements. Newspapers carried images of the king, the Prince and Princess of Wales, and other senior members of the royal family working together with evident unity. Public discussion gradually shifted from questions about constitutional change to appreciation for continuity itself. In many ways, that outcome represented the greatest success of all. The monarchy had adapted without abandoning its traditions. Its future had been strengthened without diminishing its past. As lights illuminated the palace against the London skyline, another day of royal duty quietly came to an end. The headlines would eventually be replaced. The debates would fade. New challenges would undoubtedly arise. But the principles guiding the institution remained unchanged: service before recognition, responsibility before privilege, and stability before uncertainty. For Catherine, those principles would define every step forward. Not because they had been written into an official document, but because they had already become part of the example she intended to leave for the generations that would one day inherit the crown. The king reinforced the stability of the crown. William stood beside a partner who had earned confidence through quiet determination. Catherine embraced a responsibility that demanded patience, judgment, and unwavering dedication to duty. In the end, the true measure of leadership was never the authority someone received, but the wisdom with which they chose to exercise it. As one chapter quietly closed and another began, the monarchy looked toward its future with renewed confidence, guided by service rather than spectacle. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next royal documentary. We'll see you in the next one.